get down to business, because yesterday I was screwing around a lot and just talking about country music lyrics and things like that. We didn't get to nearly enough Bible, and today we're going to get a lot of things done. We're in Matthew chapter 24. We're getting toward the end of Jesus' answer to the question that his disciples asked about when all of the end of things is going to happen and what will be the signs of the return of the Son of Man. Jesus answered the question in three parts. The first one is a whole lot of things are just going to happen. It seems like a big deal, but it's just the world being the world. Don't worry about that. Just be faithful and roll along. The second part of the answer is there's going to be a profaning of something holy, a profaning of the temple. Stuff's going to get weird and it's going to get difficult during that time. People are going to start under that pressure being like, oh, I think that's Son of Man. I think that's the return. None of that is. You will know. Do not get into that metaphorical candy van. Those are fake messiahs. And then the third part of his answer, which draws super heavily on imagery and little nuggets of language from the Old Testament with giant packets of meaning tagged onto them, starts in verse 29. And this is the stuff about what it's actually going to look like when actually the Son of Man returns. And yesterday we started by looking at Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, which indicates that there is to be some sort of time of tribulation when everything is rocking and shaking loose here. And that corresponds, I think, to what we read in verses like 22 of Matthew 24 up through 29. There's all that stuff about pregnant nursing mothers and flying to the hills and the danger and get out and a bunch of people lying about stuff. And then Jesus says in Matthew 24:29, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. I think the original audience would have been overloading on catchphrases and nuggets and things that in their minds would resonate with them the way pop lyrics from your childhood resonate with you, because there is so much there, starting with a reference to Isaiah 13 and verse 10, which goes thusly. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. Okay, that sounds like almost verbatim for the first half of what Jesus says in Matthew 24. But what's the larger context here? Because there's a ton happening in Isaiah. And it kind of depends on where you are. Okay, Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1, an oracle concerning Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw. All right, so this chapter then in Isaiah 13 is one of those places where God is using one of the nations of the world to punish his people. We know that Nebuchadnezzar's conquest is held out in the Old Testament as being a judgment against Israel or Judah. But there's this motif throughout the Old Testament that the corrupt nations that God uses to correct and punish his people, that they also are going to be punished, because it's not like they're getting off scot-free. They're being used in their evil to accomplish a good correction, a disciplining of his people. And so throughout the second half, or the last 40% of the Old Testament, throughout all the prophets, you constantly see these denunciation passages directed at long forgotten empires that you got to go and Google real hard to remember who they were, Edom or whatever. But here we're talking about Babylon. I mean, this is a big one. And so everybody would have known it, because Babylon is somebody who is a vile enemy of the Hebrew people. The original audience would not have had fond memories, or cultural memory, as it were, of the Babylonians. And they would have taken solace in this idea that Babylon is going to get corrected. Now, the original audience, we can intuit from what we know extra-biblically and from the way Babylon as a term gets employed throughout even parts of the New Testament, that Babylon was like a code word sometimes. It was a little bit of a metaphor for the world order in the first century that was spearheaded by Rome and the god emperors who, well, they appointed themselves as god emperors. So this Babylon thing that Jesus is referencing back to in chapter 24, on its surface, is a recollection that God will judge all of these things that profane and that do damage. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar was one of the profaners of the temple. So there's some correspondence here with that idea of the abomination that causes desolation from a few verses earlier. But there'd be a second layer of meaning, that there's hope for the Jewish people, that where God rightly punished Nebuchadnezzar and Belteshazzar for the way they profaned the temple way back in the 6th century BC. So also this new Babylon, who also participated in a profaning of the temple under Pompey, this new Babylon being Rome, they got some judgment coming too. All of that to say that in Matthew 24, when Jesus says the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light as a sign of the return of the Son of Man, that's going to conjure Babylon stuff. It's going to conjure Rome stuff. It's going to conjure Mosaic covenant stuff. I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my chosen people. Everybody's going to know that I'm your God and you're my people, because if you obey me, I'll bless you. If you disobey me, I'll punish you. Like that whole motif through the entire Old Testament. All of that is going to come to mind here. So with just employing that little phrase from Isaiah 13, a phrase that probably a lot of the original audience drew tremendous comfort from, Jesus is suggesting that there is an order to history, that everything is headed in some kind of direction, and that all of it is connected not just to a random story unfolding with time, but that Jesus is the culminating moment of that story, and that his return is sort of the end game of that story, or the beginning of the end game. A lot there. And if that's all Jesus was alluding to with that phrase, and if that's all that those words conjured in the mind of the original audience, that would be quite a bit of meaning packed in there, but we are just getting to the tip of the iceberg. Turn over a little bit in Isaiah 24, if you're doing the thing where you actually listen to this with an actual physical Bible. If you don't have an actual physical Bible, I'm gonna read it to you, so it's all gonna work out. Isaiah 24:23, the moon will be abashed, the sun ashamed, for the Lord Almighty will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem and before its elders gloriously. And that rounds out a whole chapter that is about a period of great suffering. It sounds like what's being talked about through Isaiah chapter 24 is the same kind of stuff that we were looking at back in Daniel 12, this idea of a tribulation. And maybe don't let your brain go right to, if you're a Christian and you've been around Christian culture and stuff, maybe don't let your brain go right to like the Left Behind stuff and all of those debates. I don't know for sure that that's what we have in view here. I think those conversations have to be sorted out looking at other passages later on in the New Testament. Here, what we know for sure is that the earth is struggling in what is predicted in Isaiah chapter 24. The Lord is going to lay waste to the earth and devastate it. He will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. It'll be the same for the priest as for the people, for the master as for the servant. So it sounds like almost like a Pompeii kind of thing, where in that moment, Vesuvius starts to erupt. Like everybody's about to get covered in boiling hot ash and die. It doesn't matter how fancy your outfit is or how impressive your title is or what's in your bank account. You better run real fast, because these kind of calamities like war or natural disasters or going to the DMV all have a very leveling effect that takes away all distinctions in society, and we all suffer together. It's not a fun passage at all, but it's probably worth your time to go and read all of Isaiah 24 as we're talking about this, because it gives you more of a sense of whatever this time of great trouble that Isaiah is talking about and that Jesus is invoking in Matthew 24. It gives you more of a sense of how all of that's going to play. And now I would say that if those two things, Isaiah 13 and Isaiah 24 that we just looked at, were all that Jesus' words would conjure in the minds of the original audience, dang, like we're talking about now Babylon and Rome and some future unfolding of history that they would have been aware of, I'd say, wow, that's a lot. Jesus packed a ton in there. But wait, there's more. Ezekiel 32 is another one of those references like we were just talking about with Babylon, where God says, yep, I used that nation to judge and correct my people, but also that nation is not getting off the hook. They are guilty of all of the blood they've shed and the evil that they've done as well. And specifically in Ezekiel 32, there's a word of judgment against Egypt, and this line is present in 7. When I snuff you out, mercy, this kind of language in the Bible gets dark at times, but I mean, it's God, it's his business. I'm not equipped to do any snuffing out. It's freaky. I don't know, make of it what you will. I will cover the heavens and darken their stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights in the heavens I will darken over you. I will bring darkness over your land, declares the sovereign Lord. That's kind of a fun one, isn't it? Because you think about what an oracle like that, a prophecy like that of judgment against Egypt means, given the history, the shared history between the God of Abraham and the Egyptian people? Like when he says, like, I'm gonna cover your land in darkness. I'm promising you a plague of darkness and messing with the heavens as you perceive them. Like if you're an Egyptian and somebody else's God gives a prophecy like this, maybe you're like, okay, whatever. Like, bring it, Molech. Oh, okay. Well, we'll keep a real close eye on our moon to make sure it doesn't get blotted out. Okay, thank you. But if it's Jehovah, the God of the Hebrews, maybe you're like, oh, dang, you did that once and we hated it. It was the worst thing ever. Please don't do the frog and blood thing again, too. That was awful. Or maybe you're just happy because you're like, well, dang, he didn't say anything about frogs or blood. Maybe this will be a little bit nicer set of plagues than we got last time. If you have to have plagues, just darkness, we could roll with that for a while. The point is, Jesus' language in Matthew 24 to the disciples is going to conjure in the minds of the disciples this imagery from Ezekiel 32, which again comes with two levels of meaning. One, it brings to mind a happy reflection on a time when God judged the enemies of his people, and it also brings to mind an unhappy reflection on the times when God used Egypt to correct and discipline his own people. And by Jesus alluding to a judgment against Babylon and a judgment against Egypt, it's also a reminder that, like, we're not talking about the small players here. Like, think about what happened when these empires went down. It was catastrophic. Their failure was gigantic and public and catastrophic, and it felt like the whole world was shaking. But Jesus' language indicates that what is going to happen with the return of the Son of Man and in the time of this difficulty will be even more unmissable than the collapse and destruction of given empires in Egypt and of the Babylonians in general. And you might be like, wow, how did Jesus get so much in there that's so much meaning that he packed into just one little thing with such efficiency of words? Thank goodness that's all, because I don't know if my brain could handle there being any more meaning in there, and I would just have to be like, thanks to my recent Google research, there's more. And also, we're out of time, so we're going to work on the there's more in terms of these Old Testament allusions coming out of this little chunk of Matthew chapter 24. Mañana. We got so much more done today than we got done yesterday. It's amazing what happens when we sing that Let's Get Down to Business song at the beginning of things. All right, catch you tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. We'll do this again soon.